St. Peter and St. Paul. The history of the Catholic Church cannot be understood without the luminous presence of St. Peter and St. Paul, two pillars who, with their lives and martyrdoms, laid the foundations of the Christian faith. Although they had different origins, temperaments, and missions, both became columns of the same church, united by love for Christ and by the blood shed in Rome. Peter, the humble fisherman of Galilee, and Paul, the cultured Pharisee of Tarsus, represent the synthesis of redeemed humanity, the simple man who believes and the wise man who understands. Their journeys, which begin in different worlds, converge on the cross of Christ and on the proclamation of the gospel to the whole world. Simon, son of Jonah, made his living by fishing on the Sea of Galilee when he encountered Jesus. The Master's gaze pierced his heart and changed his life forever. "You are Simon, son of Jonah. You shall be called Cephas," Jesus said to him, giving him a new name that meant rock. From that moment, Simon became Peter, the one upon whom Christ would build his church. He was not a perfect man. He was impetuous. He spoke before thinking. He feared and faltered. But Jesus saw beyond human frailties. He saw the sincere faith and the heart ready to love to the end. Peter followed the Lord closely. He witnessed miracles, walked on water, and courageously professed, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Yet he also denied him 3 times, overcome by fear, on the night when Christ was handed over. This moment of weakness, however, was not the end but the beginning of his transformation. He wept bitterly and was forgiven by the risen Christ himself, who entrusted to him the care of the flock. "Feed my sheep." From then on, Peter became the shepherd of the nascent church, leading it with humility and firmness. While Peter represented simple faith and unshakable obedience, Paul symbolized missionary vigor and intelligence enlightened by grace. Born in Tarsus, educated under the Mosaic law and taught by Gamaliel, he was a man of great religious zeal. At first, he persecuted Christians violently, believing he was defending the purity of the Jewish faith. But on the road to Damascus, a light surrounded him, and a divine voice echoed, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Fallen to the ground, blind and disarmed, Paul had his life converted. There began the apostle to the Gentiles, the tireless missionary who would carry the name of Christ to the ends of the Roman Empire. From his conversion onward, Paul lived solely to proclaim the gospel. His missionary journeys took him to Greece, Asia Minor, Macedonia, and Rome. He suffered shipwrecks, imprisonments, and persecutions, but he never gave up. His letters, written to Christian communities, became an essential part of sacred scripture and shaped Christian theology. In them, Paul reveals a heart passionate for Christ and a profoundly contemplative mind, which understood faith not as theory, but as a life transformed by grace. "It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me," he wrote, summing up the essence of his conversion. The encounter between Peter and Paul, recounted in the Acts of the Apostles and by the tradition of the Church, represents the fruitful dialogue between faith and reason, between the nascent church of the Jews and the universal mission among the Gentiles. Both were called to Rome, the center of the ancient world, where their lives converged in the same destiny: martyrdom. Peter, crucified upside down out of humility, and Paul, beheaded for being a Roman citizen, sealed with their blood the testimony of their faith. Rome, bathed in their sacrifice, became the heart of Christendom, the city of the apostles and martyrs. When the Church celebrates St. Peter and St. Paul on June 29th, it recalls not only 2 men, but 2 complementary paths of holiness. Peter is the rock upon which Christ builds his church. Paul is the trumpet that proclaims the gospel to the world. Both show that following Christ requires firm faith and the courage to proclaim, even in the face of persecutions. Their lives teach that love for God transforms the weak into the strong and the enemy into an apostle. United in heaven, they continue to intercede for the church they helped to found and guide. The witness of these two apostles is an invitation to unity. Peter and Paul, different in origin and mission, found their communion in the love of Christ. The church is called to live this same unity, not in uniformity, but in reconciled diversity. Just as Peter represented authority and Paul missionary ardor, each Christian is called to contribute his gifts to the building of the kingdom of God. Holiness, after all, blossoms when faith is lived in communion and the gospel becomes the center of all actions. The ruins of Rome still guard the echo of their voices today. St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican and the Basilica of St. Paul. Outside the walls are living testimonies of their eternal presence. Pilgrims from all over the world go to these places to give thanks, to ask, and to renew their faith. There, before their tombs, one understands that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and that, upon this seed, Christ continues to build his mystical body. St. Peter and St. Paul are not merely figures of the past, but living presences who inspire the church of all times. Today, more than ever, the example of these apostles is necessary. In a divided and confused world, Peter and Paul remind us that faith is the foundation that sustains, and love is the force that transforms. Their lives point to what is essential: fidelity to Christ, even when the path is difficult. They teach us that there is no true mission without the cross, nor true faith without charity. Thus, to celebrate them is to renew the commitment to be a disciple, to proclaim the gospel, and to remain firm in the hope of the resurrection. Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine is one of the most fascinating and profound figures in the history of the Catholic Church. His life is the portrait of human restlessness in search of truth and divine grace. Born in Tagaste in North Africa on November 13, 354, Augustine grew up amid a complex cultural reality, marked by the decadence of the Roman Empire and the philosophical effervescence of the time. His mother, Saint Monica, was a woman of exemplary faith who dedicated her life to her son's conversion. His father, Patricius, was a pagan and strong-tempered. From an early age, Augustine showed great intelligence and thirst for knowledge, which would lead him to travel a long path between reason and faith. His story is, above all, the testimony of a restless heart that found rest only in God. During his youth, Augustine allowed himself to be seduced by worldly pleasures and by the philosophical currents of his time. Seeking answers to the questions that tormented him, he plunged into the study of rhetoric, philosophy, and literature, standing out as a brilliant orator and thinker. However, despite his intelligence and success, he felt an inner emptiness that nothing could fill. He became involved with Manichaeism, a sect that claimed to explain the problem of evil, but soon perceived its contradictions. In his own words, "I had become a great problem to myself." The restlessness of his soul accompanied him everywhere, and although he sought the truth, he still did not recognize it in the Christian faith that his mother so strongly upheld. Augustine lived for a time in Carthage, where he gave himself over to a dissolute life and had a son with a woman with whom he maintained a stable relationship for many years. This son, Adeodatus, would also be an instrument of grace in his father's life. Augustine's fame as a teacher led him to Rome and then to Milan, where destiny brought him close to the man who would be decisive in his conversion, Saint Ambrose. The Bishop of Milan, with his wisdom and eloquence, deeply impressed Augustine. For the first time, he saw in the Christian faith a deep and luminous reason, capable of dialoguing with philosophy. Ambrose welcomed him kindly and helped him understand that faith and reason are not enemies, but allies in the search for truth. It was in Milan that Augustine lived the turning point of his life. In the midst of an intense inner crisis, torn between the desire to follow God and the difficulty of abandoning his vices, he heard a child's voice say, "Take and read." Obeying this impulse, he opened the scriptures and read the passage from the letter to the Romans, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in lust and debauchery, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ. These words pierced his soul like a sword. There, the restless man, the proud philosopher, and the repentant sinner surrendered to divine grace. His conversion was complete, profound, and transformative. Baptized by St. Ambrose on the night of Easter in 387, Augustine was reborn to a new life in Christ. After his conversion, Augustine returned to Africa, wishing to live in retreat and contemplation. However, God was calling him to serve in a broader way. He was ordained a priest and later Bishop of Hippo, a position he exercised with wisdom and dedication for more than 30 years. As pastor, preacher, and theologian, he devoted himself tirelessly to the defense of the Catholic faith against the heresies that threatened the unity of the Church, such as Manichaeism, Donatism, and Pelagianism. His preaching was clear, profound, and touched hearts. He did not speak only as a philosopher, but as a man who had experienced divine mercy. "Love and do what you will," he said, summing up in a phrase the Christian ideal of a life guided by true love. St. Augustine's literary and theological work is one of the most vast and influential in all Christian history. He wrote treatises, sermons, letters, and books that shaped the thought of the Church and Western civilization. Among his best-known works are The Confessions and The City of God. In The Confessions, Augustine narrates his spiritual journey with a sincerity and depth that move readers to this day. It is the first great autobiographical account in human history, in which a man opens himself before God and recognizes that his entire life was a path of seeking and of encounter with divine love. In The City of God, written in response to the fall of Rome, he sketches a grand vision of human history divided between the city of men and the city of God, between self-love and the love of God. St. Augustine's thought decisively influenced Christian theology and Western philosophy. His reflections on original sin, grace, freedom, and love deeply marked the magisterium of the Church. For him, evil is not a substance but the absence of good. The human heart is restless until it rests in God, and true wisdom is born of humility before the Creator. His capacity to unite reason and faith, philosophy and theology, made him the Doctor of Grace, a title that expresses the essence of his spiritual experience. Augustine showed that man, no matter how far he may be from God, can always return to him through the conversion of the heart. The figure of St. Augustine is also a model of pastor and penitent. Even after his conversion, he never considered himself a perfect saint, but a sinner in constant search of mercy. In his homilies, he spoke with tenderness and realism about human frailty and the transforming power of divine forgiveness. His spirituality, deeply centered on interiority, invites every Christian to dive within himself to find there the presence of God. "Do not go outside," he said. "Enter into yourself. In the inner man dwells the truth." This message crosses the centuries and remains current in a distracted and superficial world. In the last years of his life, St. Augustine faced the siege of the Vandals in Hippo. Even sick, he continued preaching, writing, and serving his people with courage and faith. He died on August 28, 430, at the age of 75, while the city was being invaded. His last days were marked by prayer and the reading of the penitential psalms, in a gesture of humility and total surrender to God. His death was not the end, but the consummation of a life entirely turned toward divine love. His influence spread throughout Christendom, and his writings continue to enlighten theologians, philosophers, and the faithful all over the world. St. Augustine is remembered as the man who traveled all human roads before finding the path of grace. His life shows that holiness is not the absence of sin, but the victory of grace over sin. It is the testimony that God never tires of waiting for the return of his children. Every tear of St. Monica, every preaching of St. Ambrose, and every word of Scripture were instruments of divine providence to transform a restless heart into one of the greatest saints of the Church. To celebrate St. Augustine is to celebrate the power of grace that changes life, the strength of love that conquers sin, and the beauty of the soul that finds eternal rest in God. Saint Rita of Cascia. Saint Rita of Cascia is one of the most beloved and venerated saints of the Catholic Church, known as the Saint of Impossible Causes. Her life is a testimony of unshakable faith, patience in trials, and heroic love for Christ crucified. Born in 1381 in the small village of Roccaporena, near the city of Cascia in Italy, Rita came into the world in a time marked by wars and injustices. Her parents, Antonio and Amata Lotti, were simple people but deeply Christian. They received her as a miracle, for they were already elderly and had no children. From an early age, Rita showed a gentle, compassionate heart inclined toward prayer. She dreamed of consecrating her life to God, but divine will would lead her along a path full of crosses before she reached holiness. While still young, Rita was given in marriage to Paolo Ferdinando Mancini, a man of violent and impulsive temperament who belonged to one of the most powerful families in the region. It was a difficult union, full of suffering, but Rita lived it with fidelity and Christian resignation. Even in the face of her husband's offenses, jealousy, and aggressiveness, she responded with silence, patience, and prayer. Through her witness, she gradually touched Paolo's heart, and he converted and began to live more serenely. This transformation, however, did not free him from old enmities. One day, he was murdered in an act of vengeance. Rita's pain was immense, but she sincerely forgave the killers, offering her suffering to God for the salvation of all. After her husband's death, Rita faced a new anguish. Her twin sons swore to avenge their father. Desperate, she threw herself at the foot of the crucifix, asking God not to allow them to stain their hands with the blood of hatred. Her prayers were answered in a mysterious way. Both fell gravely ill and died reconciled with God before they could commit the sin of vengeance. Rita, now a widow and without children, found herself alone in the world. Amid her pain, she decided to give herself completely to Christ and to fulfill her old desire to consecrate herself to the Lord as a religious. Her heart would finally find rest in monastic life. Rita went to the convent of the Augustinian Sisters of Cascia, asking to be admitted. However, she was refused several times, for the convent did not accept widows and also feared the family feuds surrounding her story. Determined, Rita placed her trust in God. It is said that one night, while praying before her crucifix, she was mysteriously led by her interceding saints, St. John the Baptist, St. Augustine, and St. Nicholas of Tolentino, into the convent, although the doors were locked. The nuns, surprised by the miracle, recognized there the sign of divine will and accepted her into the community. Rita then began a new stage of her life, marked by prayer, penance, and charity. In the convent, St. Rita stood out for her humility, obedience, and love of neighbor. She was seen as an example of patience and meekness. Her penances were severe, yet always accompanied by a gentleness that edified the sisters. She spent long hours in contemplation before the crucified, meditating on the passion of Christ. It was during one of these intense prayers, around the year 1442, that she received one of the most impressive signs of her union with the Redeemer. A thorn from Christ's crown came loose and wounded her forehead, leaving a deep and painful wound. This wound, which emitted a strong odor, accompanied her until death, making her a real participant in Jesus' sufferings. During the following years, Saint Rita's life was marked by miracles and mystical experiences. Despite physical pain and the isolation caused by the wound, she kept a serene spirit and a heart full of love. Her cell became a place of pilgrimage, where people came seeking comfort, counsel, and intercession. One of the most famous miracles of her life occurred shortly before her death. Being very ill and bedridden, she asked a relative to bring her a rose from the garden of her old house in Roccaperena. It was the middle of winter, and the ground was covered with snow, but miraculously, the woman found a blooming fresh rose. Upon receiving it, Rita smiled and thanked God. Because of this, the rose became a symbol of her devotion and of the divine grace that blossoms even in the coldest seasons of the soul. Saint Rita died on May 22, 1457, after a long illness, leaving behind a perfume of holiness that spread throughout the region. At the moment of her death, the convent filled with a heavenly fragrance, and many people witnessed mysterious lights around her body. Her body remained incorrupt for centuries and is exposed to this day in the sanctuary of Cascia, where thousands of pilgrims flock every year to pray and give thanks for the graces received. The Church officially recognized her sanctity on May 24, 1900, when Pope Leo XIII canonized her, proclaiming her a model of Christian virtue and a powerful intercessor before God. Devotion to Saint Rita quickly spread throughout the world, becoming one of the most popular devotions in the Catholic Church. She is invoked especially in impossible causes, in marriages in crisis, in difficult family situations, and in afflicted hearts. Her example teaches that patience, forgiveness, and trust in God are the most powerful weapons of the Christian. Saint Rita was not a woman who had an easy life, but a woman who knew how to transform pain into prayer and suffering into love. Her name became synonymous with hope, and her life proves that nothing is impossible for the one who truly believes and loves. The witness of Saint Rita is profoundly current, for it shows that holiness is possible even amid the difficulties of the world. She teaches us that it is possible to be faithful to God in the family, in marriage, in pain, and even in injustices. Her life is a silent song of forgiveness and fidelity. In the heart of a wounded woman, God caused the grace of redemption to blossom. Every tear shed by Rita was transformed into a seed of hope, and every cross she bore became an instrument of love. Her example continues to inspire the faithful to follow the path of the cross with courage and faith. Today, the devotees of Saint Rita of Cascia find in her a spiritual mother who understands the pains of life. In every church dedicated to the saint, there are flowers, roses, and prayers that rise to heaven. Many bear witness to healings, reconciliations, and miracles obtained through her intercession. Her message is simple yet powerful. Trust in God and persevere in love. She lived the faith to its last consequences, and for this reason is called the Saint of Impossible Causes. May the example of Saint Rita teach us to bear trials with patience, to forgive without measure, and to believe that the love of God can transform even the most desperate situations. To celebrate Saint Rita of Cascia is to celebrate the triumph of grace over human suffering. It is to remember that the cross, when embraced with love, becomes a path of salvation. In a world that seeks quick solutions and avoids sacrifice, Rita's life resounds as an invitation to perseverance and trust in divine providence. She shows us that holiness is not born from the absence of pain, but from fidelity to God amid pains. Her story is a light for all who feel lost, wronged, or discouraged. Saint Rita of Cascia remains alive in the faith of the people, as a sign that the impossible happens when the human heart unites with the heart of Christ. Saint Francis of Assisi. Saint Francis of Assisi is one of the most admired and luminous figures in the history of the Catholic Church, a man who, by renouncing everything, became the owner of an incomparable spiritual wealth. Born in 1182 in the Italian city of Assisi, Francis was the son of a wealthy cloth merchant, Pietro Bernardone, and of a pious and gentle mother, Lady Pica. From a young age, Francis proved cheerful, charismatic, and generous, but also vain and fond of life's pleasures. He enjoyed parties, music, and banquets, and he dreamed of glories and conquests. His temperament was sensitive and kind, but still dominated by the charms of the world. However, God already looked upon him with tenderness, preparing him for a profound transformation that would change not only his life, but the entire history of the Church. During his youth, Francis took part in conflicts between Assisi and neighboring cities. Full of bravery, he desired to be a knight and achieve military honor. However, in one of his expeditions, he was captured and spent a long period in prison. This painful experience was the beginning of his interior conversion. In prison, weakened and alone, he began to perceive the emptiness of human glories. Once freed, he fell ill and plunged into an existential crisis. The things that had once fascinated him lost their shine, and he began to seek answers in prayer and silence. One day, upon meeting a leper and overcoming his natural repulsion, he got down from his horse, embraced the man, and kissed his hand. In that simple and divine gesture, Francis discovered the living presence of Christ in the poorest and most suffering. It was the decisive point of his spiritual life. From that encounter onward, Francis began to distance himself from the luxury and ambitions of the past. He spent hours praying in the abandoned churches of Assisi, especially in the small chapel of San Damiano. One day, while praying before the crucifix, he clearly heard the voice of Christ saying to him, "Francis, rebuild my church, which is in ruins." Taking these words literally, he began to restore the little church of San Damiano with his own hands, asking for stones and alms throughout the city. His father, irritated by his son's behavior, demanded that he renounce his inheritance. Then Francis, filled with courage and love for God, stripped himself of all his clothes before the bishop and the people, declaring, "From now on, I will say only, 'Our Father, who art in heaven.'" And that gesture of total surrender marked the birth of a new man, free from all possession and completely given over to divine providence. Living as a beggar and pilgrim, Francis began to proclaim the gospel with joy and simplicity. His preaching was not made of great discourses, but of living examples of humility, love, and fraternity. He saw in all creatures an expression of God's love. The sun, the moon, the animals, and even the flowers spoke to him of the goodness of the Creator. He called all things brothers and sisters, seeing in every being a divine spark. From this vision of universal communion was born his famous Canticle of the Creatures, a hymn of praise to the beauty and harmony of creation. Francis wanted the whole world to recognize God's loving presence in everything, and for man to learn to live in peace with all beings. Francis' life soon began to attract followers. Young men from Assisi and other regions, touched by his holiness, decided to follow his example of poverty and love. Thus was born the Order of Friars Minor, approved by Pope Innocent III in 1209. The name Minor expressed the ideal of humility and service that Francis so prized. He did not want to found a powerful order, but a group of brothers who would live the gospel in its original purity. His motto was simple and radical: to follow Christ, poor and crucified. The friars' life was marked by prayer, work, and charity. They walked barefoot, begged for alms, and preached peace, bringing hope to hearts and converting many with their silent testimony. The fame of Saint Francis spread rapidly throughout Italy and Europe. His presence radiated joy and holiness. He was called the little poor man of Assisi, and many considered him a new Christ. He spoke with birds, consoled the sick, and embraced lepers with tenderness. His simplicity was disarming and his faith contagious. He deeply loved the Eucharist and the Church, always obedient to the Pope and the priests. At a time when many criticized the hierarchy and the luxury of the clergy, Francis showed that true reform begins with the conversion of the heart and the authentic living of the gospel. His life was a living sermon, an invitation to purity and peace. Among the countless remarkable episodes of his life stands out the meeting with the Sultan of Egypt during the Crusades. Moved by the desire to take the gospel even to the enemies of the faith, Francis crossed the battlefield and presented himself unarmed before Sultan Malik al-Kamil. Instead of being killed, he was received with respect and was able to dialogue about God and the Christian faith. This attitude of courage and peace showed that love and respect are more powerful than weapons. Francis did not seek to convert by force, but by the example of love. His witness inspired generations of missionaries and is a milestone of the true Christian spirit, to be an instrument of peace in a world divided by hatred. In the last years of his life, St. Francis intensified his union with Christ through prayer and contemplation. He often withdrew to Mount Laverna, where he sought silence and solitude. It was there in 1224 that he received the sublime gift of the stigmata, the wounds of Christ imprinted on his body. These sacred wounds, which bled and hurt, became a sign of his perfect identification with the crucified Lord. Francis did not see in this a reason for glory, but for humility and gratitude. His soul was consumed with love, and his body, weakened by penances, reflected the holiness of one who had become a living image of the crucified. Francis' health began to decline, and he serenely prepared for death. He asked to be laid on bare earth, a sign of his complete poverty, and joyfully recited Psalm 141, surrendering his soul to God. He died on October 3rd, 1226, at the age of 44, leaving a legacy of love, humility, and peace that spans the centuries. 2 years later, he was canonized by Pope Gregory IX, and his native city, Assisi, became one of the principal centers of pilgrimage in the Christian world. The example of Francis remains alive, especially through the Franciscan order, which continues his mission of evangelizing with simplicity and love for the poor. Saint Francis of Assisi is, to this day, the symbol of universal love, peace, and perfect Christian joy. He teaches us that true wealth lies in possessing only God, and that happiness is born of total self-giving. His life is a response to the materialistic emptiness of the modern world, and a call to conversion, fraternity, and care for creation. Francis was the man who knew how to see God in all things, and all things in God. His prayer, "Lord, make me an instrument of your peace," remains an eternal call to all hearts. May the example of the little poor man of Assisi inspire every Christian to live with simplicity, love, and gratitude, transforming the world by the silent force of goodness and faith. Saint Benedict of Nursia. Saint Benedict of Nursia is one of the most influential and venerated figures in the history of the Catholic Church, considered the patriarch of Western monasticism and the patron of Europe. Born around the year 480 in the city of Nursia, in the region of Umbria, Italy, he lived in a time of great political and moral instability. The Roman Empire had fallen, and Europe faced times of chaos and barbarity. In this context of darkness, Benedict would arise as a light of wisdom and holiness. From a young age, he showed a deep inclination toward the spiritual life. His parents sent him to Rome to study, but the corruption and luxury of the city scandalized him. Wishing to follow a purer path closer to God, he abandoned everything and withdrew to live in solitude and prayer in the mountains near Subiaco. During the years in Subiaco, Benedict gave himself entirely to contemplation and penance. He lived in a grotto called the Sacro Specco, sustained only by prayers and by food brought to him by a monk named Romanus. This period of solitude shaped his soul and prepared him for the great mission God would entrust to him. The young hermit went through many temptations, especially against chastity, but he overcame them all with courage and faith. It is said that once, to overcome a violent temptation, he threw himself into a thorn bush, offering the pain of the body as a purification of the soul. His fame for holiness began to spread, attracting people in search of counsel and spiritual direction. With time, Benedict was invited to be superior of a nearby monastery, but his discipline and spiritual firmness aroused resistance among some monks who even tried to poison him. When he blessed the cup before the meal, he perceived the danger and saw the vessel miraculously break apart. Faced with this sign, he left the place and returned to his life of solitude. But his holiness continued to attract disciples. Over the years, he founded 12 small monasteries in the region of Subiaco, each with 12 monks, symbolizing the apostles. The lifestyle he proposed was balanced, based on prayer, work, and obedience, principles that would become the essence of his spirituality. Later, Saint Benedict moved to Monte Cassino, where he founded the monastery that would become the heart of Benedictine monasticism and a symbol of Christian civilization in Europe. It was there that he wrote his famous Rule of Life, known as the Rule of Saint Benedict, a set of practical and spiritual guidelines that united discipline and mercy, prayer and work. His motto, Ora et Labora, pray and work, became one of the pillars of monastic life and profoundly influenced Western spirituality. Benedict understood that man finds God both in prayer and in daily activities. Work for him was a way to participate in divine creation and to serve the brothers with humility. The Rule of Saint Benedict highlights virtues such as humility, obedience, silence, and fraternal love. He saw the monastery as a school for the Lord's service, where each monk should seek holiness in fidelity to small things. For Benedict, the abbot should be a father to the monks, guiding them with firmness and compassion. The community, in turn, should live in harmony, sustained by charity and mutual respect. His vision of spiritual life was profoundly human and balanced. He understood that the path to God passes through self-mastery, constancy, and love of truth. This wisdom made his rule one of the most enduring in Christian history. Besides being a founder and monastic legislator, Saint Benedict was also a great intercessor and wonder worker. Many miracles are attributed to him, including healings, deliverances, and signs of divine protection. One of the best-known symbols associated with him is the Saint Medal of Saint Benedict, a powerful sacramental against the forces of evil. Engraved upon it are the initials of the Latin words that compose a prayer of exorcism and protection, whose center is the cross of Christ. This devotion spread throughout the world, and to this day, millions of the faithful carry the medal as a sign of faith and a spiritual shield. The cross and the name of Jesus, so loved by Benedict, are the expression of Christ's victory over evil. Saint Benedict was also a great master of peace and order. While the world around him sank into barbarity, he founded monasteries that became centers of prayer, culture, and civilization. His monks copied books, preserved classical knowledge, and educated generations. In this way, Benedict's work laid the foundations of the Christian culture that would flourish in the Middle Ages. For this reason, he is called Father of Europe, for his influence surpassed religious limits and shaped the spiritual and cultural destiny of the West. In a time of destruction, Benedict built. In a time of hatred, he sowed peace. In a time of despair, he rekindled hope. The holiness of Saint Benedict shone in the serenity of his life and the wisdom of his words. He did not seek the glory of men, but the glory of God. His humility made him great, and his silence made him eloquent. On Monte Cassino, he spent his last years in constant prayer and in deep communion with the Lord. According to tradition, shortly before dying, he asked to receive the Eucharist and was supported by his monks, dying standing with his hands raised to heaven. It was March 23rd, 547, and the heavens seemed to open to welcome the one who had lived his entire life in the presence of God. After his death, the fame of Saint Benedict spread throughout Europe, and his rule became the model of monastic life, followed by countless communities. Centuries later, Pope Paul VI would proclaim him patron of Europe, recognizing that through his spirituality, he helped rebuild the continent upon the values of the gospel. Benedict's example remains current, especially in times of confusion and spiritual disorder. He teaches us that true peace begins within the soul, that silence is the path to hearing the voice of God, and that the balance between prayer and work is the secret of interior harmony. To celebrate Saint Benedict of Nursia is to recall that holiness is born of daily fidelity and the constant search for God in all things. He is a beacon of wisdom, humility, and faith for the modern world, so marked by haste and noise. His legacy invites us to build a solid interior life founded on prayer, honest work, and love of truth. As he wrote in his rule, "Let nothing be preferred to the love of Christ." May this principle also guide our lives, making each gesture, word, and effort a silent hymn of praise to the Creator, as lived and taught by the great patriarch of Western monasticism, Saint Benedict of Nursia.